Hello there and welcome to the video. Today we are talking about scanning and digitalizing your film negatives without any plugins. This is how I've been doing it and I thought I'd share my experience with you. We'll talk about the actual scanning and how I edit the images on the computer. So let's get into it. First we need to scan a couple of images. And I do shoot most formats. I shoot 135, 120 and 4x5 large format. Nowadays I mostly shoot black and white negative film, but in the past I've shot color negative and color positive. My scanning has evolved with the times, but nowadays I do the same thing regardless of format or film. I do mirrorless scanning, for which I use the Fujifilm X-H2, and for the longest time I used a 50mm f2 lens by Fujifilm and a couple of macro rings from Viltrox. But very recently, a good friend of mine donated a lens to me, very generously of him. And it is a vintage lens. It's a Canon FD 50mm 3.5 macro lens. And it has been a huge improvement. So that is the camera setup going forward for scanning. To actually be able to scan the film, I mount the camera on my backup tripod, which is the Manfrotto 190 X Pro 3. And this tripod has a really nice feature where you can collapse the central column to 90 degrees. Really useful for scanning. And to hold the actual film, I use the Essential film holder for 120 and 135. And for 4x5 I use the Pixl-Latr. And as a light source, I use a tracing table or light table from Kaiser. It's quite small, but gets the job done. Then it's just a matter of loading the film into the film holder and photographing the negatives. But I do have some quick notes about that. First off, it's quite important to level out the camera against the film. And to do this, I place a little mirror on top of the film holder. Then it's just a matter of leveling the camera against its own reflection. It is quite tricky to start, but once you get the hang of it, it is quite a fast and easy way to level out the camera. Then to actually adjust the height between the film plane and the camera, I adjust my table as I have an electrical adjustable table. I find that a bit easier than to fiddle around with the tripod. I turn off image stabilization. I adjust the camera so it's in manual focus mode. I focus so everything is nice and sharp. I adjust the aperture to around f8. I put the white balance into a fixed value, usually daylight. I then adjust the view settings so I have this little enlargement window up to the right. This is to check for vibrations. And finally, I use a cable release to trigger the camera. Then it's just a matter of photographing all the negatives. So that's how I scan my negatives. This setup isn't perfect, but it is good enough for me. I mostly see this as a substitute for the contact sheet and for web sharing of my images. I do my printing out in the darkroom. However, I do consider mirrorless or DSLR scanning to be the best option for most people. If you already have a digital camera, it's fairly affordable to get started with, and the quality you can get out of the scans are excellent. However, don't dismiss the alternatives. I personally used an Epson V600 flatbed scanner before, and the quality for medium format with that was actually quite good. And it has one big benefit. It takes less room for me. It can sit on the desk ready to be used whenever I want to. With my mirrorless setup for scanning, it's always a bit of fiddle before I get started with the scanning. But the quality on my old Epson V600 for the smaller format, 35mm, was never up to par, and is the reason why I switched over to mirrorless scanning. But if you're only shooting the larger format, consider a flatbed scanner. I personally am looking towards the V850, as I nowadays mostly shoot medium format and large format. And if you only shoot the small format of 35mm, you might want to look towards the Plustek scanner. They are really small, take very little room, a bit slow, but could be an option for you. With that said, Time to look on some negatives on the computer. So here we are at the computer, and I'm going to show you how I edit my film negatives in Lightroom and Photoshop without using any plugins. I'm also going to show you how I do it in Darktable, which is an open source and free software that I've started experimenting with. And I'm really impressed with the results from that software. But let's start with Lightroom and Photoshop. So here we are in Lightroom, and I have a couple images for us to look at. I rescanned all these images using the Pixl-Latr. And I did that because I want to use my new Canon macro lens to scan the images for this video. And I ended up using the Pixl-Latr because it's faster to change between the formats when using that film holder. Anyhow, let's look at the images. So I have 3 black and white and 1 color image for us. And we are starting with the black and white. And I'm just going to open the first image here in the develop module. And I'm going to do 2 adjustments. I'm going to go into the basic module and fix the white balance. Just sampling anywhere in the image. When it's a black and white image, you can do that. And then I'm going down in the tone curve to invert the image. So just inverting the tone curve, pulling up the blacks and pulling down the highs will invert the image for you. After I've done that, I'm going to sync the setting over on all the images. If I had the same white balance and the exposure set in camera when scanning, it will be good enough for culling purposes. So hitting sync, just selecting all the images and hitting sync, I'm going to synchronize the settings. So I can jump back into the library module and do the culling there. So selecting the first image, let's say that looks quite decent, so 4 star. Looks interesting enough, 3 star, okay, 1 star, etc, etc. You get the idea. I can then go in and say, okay, I want to look a bit closer on this image here. As we can see here, this image is a bit darker and the white balance is slightly off. That's because this image is another film stock than the first image. And it was probably a bit underexposed. So I'm heading over to the develop module. I'm fixing the white balance. Looks better, but it is a bit dark. If I were to go down in the exposure and just pull that up, you'll notice that the control is inverted. And this annoys me. So what I'm doing is I'm jumping over into Photoshop. So I'm just selecting the image down here, right clicking, going edit in Photoshop. The first time you're doing that, it will take a minute or 2 to load. But if you leave Photoshop open in the background, the next image will load substantially faster. And I'm going to do 2 things in Photoshop. I'm going to adjust the crop. So I'm doing the crop tool. This is a 1:1 image. And just adjusting that. Something like so. Saving that. And the next thing I'm doing is I'm adding a levels adjustment. So going in levels and just pulling down the highs and pulling up the dark, leaving like the usable dynamic range of the film or the image. And that's the only things I'm doing in Photoshop. So I'm hitting Ctrl S to save that. And once it's saved, I'm just closing the instance here. And saving the image in Photoshop will then save it into Lightroom for you, so you can continue editing there. The nice thing by doing this is now all the controls are the right way around. So I'm going down to the tone curve, pulling down the blacks slightly. I might actually pull up the whites a bit, pulling down the blacks a bit. Something like that. I usually like to pull down the absolute white point so it doesn't turn completely white. I find that quite suitable for analog images. And adding a bit of vignette maybe, etc, etc. It starts to look quite nice. So that's how I edit images. And this works for color images as well. So here we have a color image. I'm just going to fix the white balance and I'm just sampling the border of the film here. Inverting the tone curve. Jumping over into Photoshop. Fixing the crop. And this is a 3x2, as is a 35mm image. Something like that. Adding a levels adjustment. Pulling up the blacks. And pulling down the highlights. It turns a bit blue, but we can fix that in Lightroom. So I'm just hitting Ctrl S. That saves the image for us, and we can go back into Lightroom. So the image turned a bit blue, and I'm going to fix that with just sampling a bit of the film area here. I have a white point here, or white area here, that I'm going to sample, and that fixes the white balance for us. I can then do my edit. I'm just going to pull down the blacks a bit, actually open up the tone curve, and doing it, whoops, like so. Pulling down the highlights a bit, I'm adding a bit of light into the midtones, like so. Looks quite alright. I'm actually going down in the detail section and doing a noise reduction, because there are quite a lot of noise in this image. It's probably grain, but noise reduction works fine for that as well. It will remove some of the details, but I then add a bit of sharpening. Quite a lot of sharpening. I'm going to mask out a bit of the image so we don't sharpen the sky. Like so. And that works quite well for web sharing. I think I'll add a bit of a vignette as well. That's a slight vignette. And that looks quite nice actually. So that's how I edit my film images in Lightroom and Photoshop without using any plugins. And I'm getting really good results from that. Now though, I'm going to show you how I do it in Darktable, and I'm really impressed with the results from that software. Do bear in mind, I'm a newbie on this software, so keep that in mind. So here we are in Darktable, and it is very similar in the general layout to Lightroom. So we have Lighttable, which is essentially the library module. We have Darkroom, which is essentially the develop module, and then we have a couple of others. I'm going to select the first image here, and move over to Darkroom. And we have our tools here to the right, just as in the Lightroom, but it works a bit different. This is module based instead. So we have a couple of different categories here. The first one being a quick access toolbar. Then you have your active modules. Then you have the different categories where you can find the different tools. In the active modules, there are a couple that are applied as a default when you open an image. And I'm actually going to disable two of those. Filmic RGB and color calibration. And I'm then using the white balance down here. And I'm going to fix the white balance as we did before. So I'm just sampling a bit of the area of the image, like so. And I'm then going to find a tool called Negadoctor. You can find it in those different categories, but I prefer searching. So neg, and I'll find Negadoctor. Turning it on with this little icon here, and that will invert the image for us, as if it were a color image. So I'm going to change this to black and white. And we have a couple of adjustments we can do. And a nice thing with Darktable is there's an excellent documentation of how the program works. So if I pull up our web browser here, and I go over to darktable.org, under resources you find the user manual. And it's pretty much a documentation of all the tools in Darktable. Very detailed. And I can search for Negadoctor here. And it goes over the preparations that I just did. And then you find the modules controls here, like the film properties, the corrections, etc, etc. I'm just going to show you how I work with it, but here's the proper documentation of what the tool actually does. So the film base, I'm just leaving that as the default when it comes to the black and white images. The D-mine is linked to the film base, so if I change that, I actually changes the film base color. So I'm just going to reset that, so just double click on the minus will reset that. Then we move over to Dmax. And if I hover over a tool, I get a little tooltip. And this essentially says that this is the white point of the image. I could just try and sample the image and sample the actual image. And it does a fairly good job if the negative was properly exposed. I can have a scan exposure bias here. That is if you need to adjust the midtones. I don't really need to do that here, but you could also try and sample the image if you like. But it will do very little here, as it was a fairly good exposed image. The correction tab, I don't touch that when it comes to the black and white images. I move straight over to print properties. So it's essentially fixing the negative and then fixing how it's printed. There's a couple of sliders here. The first one, paper black, that is essentially your black point, what you want to be printed black. You can adjust this manually, and that's usually how I do it, to set the black point. But you could try and sample something you want to be black, like the roof here. But that went a bit far in my taste, so I'm just going to pull that back slightly. We can then adjust print exposure, so I usually start with the paper black and move over to the print exposure. And the print exposure will move it back, so we can bring back the mids. And I'm always watching the histogram up here, so I don't cut any highlights. I can then add a paper grade if I like, and I like that terminology because it's the same as out in the darkroom. This is what paper you would use to print your actual image. It's basically the contrast. So I could do a bit more contrast, or I could pull down the contrast. I like quite a bit of contrast in this case, and I need to adjust this slightly, like so. So it is a balancing act there. Then we have something called paper gloss, and this simulates a matte or glossy paper. Quite nice, but in reality it's basically just bringing down the very highlights, or bringing them up. I like quite a glossy paper for this image, like so. So that takes care of the conversion. I can then add a couple of other tools, like fixing the crop if I like, so I'll just search for crop. Add a bit of crop, a square. Pulling in the square like so. But all the heavy lifting is done by the Negaductor. Like so. I like to add a bit of local contrast, so I find a tool called local contrast. Apply that. Has a couple of settings for it, but I like it at its default value for most cases actually. I'm also going to add a bit of vignetting. And the nice thing with the vignetting tool is you can actually specify where it happens. So I want it around here, pulling down it like so. Adjusting the fall-off radius so it's quite soft, bringing down the brightness quite a bit. And I think that's a ready done image. So that's the edits I'm doing. I'm quite pleased with this image. I really like the results from Darktable. It's fairly fast once you get used to it and figure out what tools or modules you like to use. One little fast note though, if you move back to this active modules, the order here is important. It works from the bottom up, so it will apply, in this case Negaductor, before local contrast and vignetting. So if I were to move down the vignetting below Negaductor, which you can do by holding Ctrl and Shift, it will happen before the inversion. So then you get bright corners instead of dark corners. So the order is important in Darktable. So that's how I work with the black and white images. I'm now going to show you in color images. I'm not as good at converting the color images quite yet in Darktable, but I think there is potential. This is the same image we had before, so I'm removing color calibration, filmic RGB, fixing the white balance. According to the documentation, you should sample the light, so I am doing that. And I'm applying the Negaductor. Going into film properties, I'm actually this time going to sample the edges of the film to neutralize that. And once again, I'm going to try and sample the Dmax value. It doesn't really work. It works better if I sample just the highlights though, so I'm doing that. Scanner bias, I'm actually going to drag that up slightly. But there is a slight cast on this image, so I'm going into correction. It's important to fix the shadow color cast before you start fixing the highlight. So I'm just going to sample some of the dark tones here, and then I'm going to sample some of the highlights here. And that actually fixes most of the problems. And I'm moving over to print properties as before. I'm fixing the blacks, and I'm actually going to sample this little window here. And printer exposure, I'm going to sample just the highlights here. And do a bit of a manual adjustment to bring those up. I'm adjusting the paper glass, and I'm adjusting the paper grade slightly. I'm pulling down the paper grade in this case. And I'm actually going to pull it up a bit more. Like so. And it looks fairly good. I can then do the same thing as before, add the crop. And this is a 3:2 image, so I'm changing the aspect ratio. Like so. Actually notice it's slightly crooked, so I'm leaving a bit of margin there. To fix the rotation, you can just right click and drag out a line. Like so. And then I can just apply the crop. Adding a bit of local contrast. And I'm actually going to tone this image using a tool called color correction. And here you can, the white point is highlights and the black is your dark tones. And I'm just going to fix that slight issue I'm having to a point where I like. It's an artistic interpretation of the image. Like so. I might once again add a bit of vignetting. Moving that down, I'm going to flatten that a bit. Like so. And we are getting to quite a decent image. You can work a bit more with it. I still bother a bit with the color cast. I haven't quite figured out how to work with that. As you can see, this image is slightly blue still. But I have no doubt that this tool can actually fix that, and you can get really good results also for the color images. However, I primarily shoot black and white, so for me this tool is perfect. And in general, I have been very impressed with Darktable, so much so that I'm actually thinking about abandoning Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop and moving over to Darktable and just cancel all my Adobe subscription, because I am that impressed with Darktable. Before we end the video, I want to show you the difference between the macro lens and the Fujifilm lens. I did a trial and did a couple of scans of the same images, and I have an example of that here that showcases this quite well. There's a slight difference in the edit, but close enough. One problem with Darktable is if you select the images and go into the compare view here, I haven't figured out how you can zoom. A workaround I found though is that you can open one image in Darkroom. This is, and I'm going to open the macro lens shot here, and then you can take a snapshot here. And I can then move over to the other image. This is with the Fujifilm 50mm f2 lens. I can apply that snapshot to compare. There's a slight difference in size between these images, but we can still compare the edges here. I'm going to go in to 100%, moving down up into the right here. And as you can see, this is the macro lens and this is the Fujifilm lens. This is substantially sharper than my Fujifilm lens. And I must say, this has been the biggest improvement in my mirrorless scanning, switching the lens to a macro lens over a standard lens with macro rings. I have tried different light sources. I tried a video light from Viltrox, I tried a Cinestill scanning light, and I now use a light table or tracing table. Very similar results. Exposure time differs, but that doesn't really matter for the end results. The two different film holders, or even just doing a DIY solution while just weighing down the negatives with something. Yes, it does a slight difference, but not much. But it did a huge difference just switching to a macro lens, even a vintage one like the Canon FD. So if you are going down the mirrorless or DSLR scanning route, consider getting a macro lens. Either a vintage used lens, they can be had for fairly cheap, or perhaps a TT Artisan macro lens. I think those will work just fine as well. Or perhaps adapt an enlarger lens. It has a very flat focal plane, so that might even be better than a macro lens. But that was a big improvement for me, and I'm really happy with this FD lens for scanning. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Do take care, and bye.